Hi, this is Matt Baker. Last year, prior to the US election, I made this video in which I talked about the history of US political parties. Well, this month we're having an election up here in Canada, and therefore I thought I'd make a similar video covering the history of Canadian political parties. For the US video, I mostly used this really cool hand-drawn vintage chart, but since there wasn't an equivalent available for Canada, I had to design my own chart, although I tried to make it look somewhat similar to the US one. So in today's video, I'll be explaining how the very first political parties in Canada were formed, how others arose but then vanished, and then finally how some of those older parties led to the creation of the ones that are still around today. But first, let me tell you about the resource that I've been using to follow the Canadian election and to navigate all the different perspectives in the media coverage. It's called Ground News, and it's a website and app that allows you to examine thousands of news topics from a variety of different angles. For every breaking story, they combine coverage from multiple sources so that you can compare reporting from across the political spectrum and the world. For example, they recently gathered over 500 articles about Trump's April 2nd tariff announcement. By the way, you can follow along at home by scanning the QR code on screen or by clicking the link in the description below. Sources on the left focused on the negative impact of the tariffs, whereas sources on the right focused on how April 2nd was Liberation Day. So obviously, depending on what source you read, you can end up having a totally different perspective, which is why Ground News is so useful. They even have useful charts. I love how their app uses charts like these ones to show additional data on each news source, such as whether they lean to one side politically and even where they get their funding from. It even highlights what isn't being widely covered on the blind spot feed. Thus, it can help you have more productive conversations with family and friends. So, in a world that is constantly changing, Ground News is a tool that we all need. Without it, you might miss out on important stories and perspectives. You can subscribe now by going to ground.news/charts or by using the link in the description or pinned comment. If you used my link this month, you will save 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. Okay, let's now take a look at the timeline of Canadian political parties. It starts in 1867 because, well, that's when Canada became a country. Initially, Canada had only 4 provinces, the 2 big ones being Quebec, which was and still is mostly French-speaking because it had previously been the core part of New France, and Ontario, which was and is mostly English-speaking because it had primarily been settled by former Americans who had moved there after U.S. independence in order to stay loyal to Great Britain. In Quebec, the 2 main political parties had been the Parti Bleu, meaning the Blue Party, and the Parti Rouge, meaning the Red Party. Whereas in Ontario, the 2 main parties had been the Tories and the Grits. Since the Parti Bleu and the Tories were both right-leaning, they merged to form the Conservative Party. And since the Parti Rouge and the Grits were both left-leaning, they merged to form the Liberal Party. This explains why, in Canada to this day, Conservatives use blue and Liberals use red. It also explains why the Conservatives are sometimes still called Tories, and the Liberals are still sometimes called Grits. Now, the other 2 original provinces in Canada were Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Their politicians joined either the Conservatives or the Liberals, although initially there was a large group from Nova Scotia that didn't want to join Canada, so they became known as anti-Confederates. Some of them actually won seats in the first election, but since by then Confederation was already a done deal, the Anti-Confederation Party quickly disbanded, with its members joining either the Conservatives or the Liberals. Now, on this chart, the winning party is always shown on top. So, as you can see, it was the Conservatives who won the first election, with their leader, Sir John A. Macdonald, becoming Canada's very first Prime Minister. These days, he's a controversial figure because although he helped build the country, he was also responsible for creating the Indian residential school system, which has been described as an attempt at cultural genocide against Canada's Indigenous peoples. Now, an important thing for my American viewers to understand is that Canadians do not vote directly for a prime minister. Instead, we vote for a local representative to represent our area in the national parliament. These representatives, which we call MPs, meaning members of parliament, usually belong to a particular political party. And therefore, what happens is whichever party wins the most seats in the parliament, their leader gets to be the prime minister. Now, there are some exceptions to this, which I'll point out later. The other big difference I want to point out is that Canada does not have scheduled elections every 4 years like the US does. Instead, the Canadian Prime Minister can call a federal election at any time during his or her term. And sometimes an election is even forced in cases where the leading party does not hold 50% of the seats, and therefore the other parties can decide to topple the government. Okay, so as you can see, the Conservatives dominated for the first 29 years, with the Liberals only gaining power for 4 years, under the leadership of the second Prime Minister, Alexander Mackenzie. In Canada, there is no limit to how many times a Prime Minister can serve, so Macdonald served for almost 19 years, both before and after Mackenzie. In fact, he died while still in office, from a stroke at age 75. At this point, the Conservatives had to quickly choose a new leader, and hence a new prime minister, because unlike in the US, there's no system in place for who automatically takes over. Canada thus got a series of 4 very short-serving Conservative prime ministers, none of whom were actually elected. You see, Abbott got sick and had to retire. Thompson died in office from a heart attack at age 49. Bowl was unpopular and was forced to resign. And Tupper, well, he lost the next election to the Liberals, who were now led by Sir Wilfrid Laurier. That election was a major turning point because ever since then, the Liberals have been the dominant party. From 1896 to today, they've held power 75% of the time, which is why they are sometimes referred to as Canada's natural governing party. They did not, however, hold power at the start of World War I, which led to an interesting situation. You see, during that war, there was a major debate over whether or not Canada should conscript soldiers. The governing Conservatives, led by Sir Robert Borden, were pro-conscription, but the Liberals were divided on the issue, mostly along language lines. Thus, during the election of 1917, most of the English-speaking Liberals temporarily joined the Conservatives to form a unionist government, while most of the French-speaking Liberals remained separate. After the war, Borden retired, resulting in another unelected and short-serving Prime Minister, Arthur Meighen. Now, up until this point, Canada basically had a two-party system, which is why either the Conservatives or the Liberals were almost always able to win a majority. However, starting with the end of World War I, that all changed. And ever since then, Canada has had a multi-party system. In a multi-party system, the winning party sometimes wins less than 50% of the seats, and thus has to try and cooperate with smaller parties in order to stay in power, something that's called a minority government. This happened to the Liberals for the first time in 1921. That's because that's the year that a sizable third party arrived on the scene for the first time. It was called the Progressive Party, and it mostly grew out of the United Farmers Movement, which wanted more free trade with the US. However, it also attracted several Liberal MPs who had been a part of the wartime Unionist Party. The result was that the Progressive Party was not very united. What joined them together was that they all wanted change, i.e. progress, but they didn't necessarily agree on what that progress would look like. This is why the short-lived Progressive Party eventually led to both the creation of a new left-wing party as well as the creation of a new right-wing party. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First of all, I want to point out that the Liberal Prime Minister at this point was William Lyon Mackenzie King, the man who would go on to become Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister. He, together with Borden, Laurier, and Macdonald, are the 4 Prime Ministers who have appeared on Canadian currency. Mackenzie King is on the $50 bill. Borden is on the 100. Laurier is on the 5, and Macdonald was, until very recently, on the 10. He's since been replaced by Viola Desmond, who is sometimes called the Rosa Parks of Canada. Anyhow, two unique things happened during Mackenzie King's first term. First of all, even though the Progressives actually won more seats than the Conservatives were given the role of official opposition, something that is usually reserved for second place. This is because the Progressives, who, remember, were not very united, didn't want the title. Secondly, in 1926, the Conservative leader, Arthur Meighen, became Prime Minister again, albeit very briefly, even though his party didn't have the most seats. This is a rare thing that can happen in case of a minority government, because when the first place party loses a vote of confidence, sometimes another party is given the chance to govern instead of an election being called. But as you might have guessed, what happened was that the Conservatives also lost a vote of confidence, and thus an election was called anyway. This time, Mackenzie King was able to get above 50% because several progressives, who became known as liberal progressives, agreed to support him. Around the same time, a different group of progressives formed what was called the Ginger Group. This was not an official party, but rather a sort of coalition that combined socialist-leaning progressives with similarly minded United Farmers, as well as a few MPs from a small party known as the Independent Labour Party. If we move forward to 1935, you'll see that the Ginger Group ended up forming a new party, which was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or CCF. It was definitely left-wing and aligned with a political philosophy called democratic socialism. However, at the same time, another new party was established, called the Social Credit Party, or SOCREDS for short. It too drew from former progressives, but was more socially conservative and right-wing. Thus, for the next 50 years, Canada basically had four main parties: the Liberals, center-left, and the Conservatives, center-right, but also the CCF, which was even more to the left, and the SOCRED Party, which was even more to the right. It should be noted, however, that only the Liberals and the Conservatives ever held power. I should also point out several important name changes. In 1942, the Conservative Party changed its name to the Progressive Conservative Party, or PC Party for short. That happened mostly because their leader at the time had previously been a member of a provincial Progressive Party. So strangely, the Progressive label ended up living on through the Conservatives. Another big change occurred in 1961 when the CCF was dissolved and replaced by the NDP, which stands for the New Democratic Party. To this day, they use the color orange. Their first leader was Tommy Douglas, the most famous Canadian politician to never actually serve as Prime Minister. The reason why he's so famous and well-liked is because he helped to introduce free healthcare to all of Canada. As for the SOCREDs, well, they actually split for a while along language lines from 1963 to 1973, with the French faction being called the Realignment Creditiste. They never did recover from that split though, and by the 1980s they were no longer represented in Parliament. This left Canada with only three parties, but only for about a decade because in 1993, the political landscape in Canada underwent its biggest change yet. Now, in order to explain that change, I first of all have to explain the importance of the year 1982 when it comes to Canadian history. Although 1867 is generally understood to be the year that Canada was born, it could also be argued that the actual year that Canada was born was 1982. You see, up until that point, the British Parliament still had the power to pass laws that could apply to Canada, and it still had the power to amend the Canadian Constitution. In fact, up until 1977, Canadians were still referred to as British subjects, and up until 1965, this was the official flag of Canada. You might have thought that it was this one, but that one was technically just a nautical flag. The point is, it took a long time for Canada to actually become fully independent from Great Britain, and in fact, the process was not completed until April 17, 1982. On that day, Queen Elizabeth II signed the Canada Act, which amended the Canadian Constitution, making it Canada's and Canada's only. It did not, however, make Canada a republic. To this day, Canada still shares a monarch with the UK and several other countries. But here's the thing. By this point, Canada now consisted of 10 provinces. After much negotiation, 9 out of those 10 were happy with the new constitution, but one was not, Quebec. You see, Quebec has always been a bit different from the rest of Canada because they are primarily French-speaking and have a history that goes back farther than most other parts of Canada. On one hand, this didn't really matter because the new constitution became the law of the land anyway. But on the other hand, it mattered a great deal because there was a growing movement in Quebec to separate from Canada and become its own country. Thus, in 1984, the Conservative leader Brian Mulroney ran on a promise to Quebec that he would help amend the Constitution in a way that they could be happy with. This resulted in the biggest landslide win in Canadian history. And Mulroney did carry through on his promise, negotiating a series of proposed changes to the Constitution known as the Meech Lake Accord. But this time, Quebec was happy, whereas several English-speaking provinces were not. And in the end, Meech Lake failed. This resulted in the formation of 2 new regionally based parties. First, there was the Bloc Québécois, whose expressed goal was to achieve Quebec separation. But there was also the Reform Party based in the West, which was upset that Quebec was getting so much attention, while the Western provinces were not. It was even further to the right than the PC Party, and was founded by the son of a former Socred leader. So, in the 1993 election, the PC Party was now led by Kim Campbell, Canada's only female prime minister to date. But they suffered a colossal defeat, going from 156 seats to just 2. And to everyone's surprise, the Bloc Québécois came in second, with the Reform Party finishing in third. 2 years later, a referendum was held in Quebec, and the separatists almost won, achieving 49.4% of the vote. From there, the Bloc went down and the Reform went up, becoming the official opposition and seemingly the new dominant party on the right. But the PC Party was still getting enough support to split the vote on the right, and it became clear that the right would never be able to form government if it remained divided. So efforts were made to unite the right, starting with a rebranding of Reform as the Canadian Alliance, and eventually a full merger, with the new party returning to the Conservative brand, with the Progressive part being dropped. This new Conservative Party came to power in 2006 under Stephen Harper, and in 2011, the Liberal Party fell to third place for the first time, with the NDP achieving second place for the first time. In other words, nowadays, Canada truly has a multi-party system, with anyone being able to fall from grace and anyone being able to rise up. Since 2011, there's even been a fifth party, the Greens, with a few seats. Which brings us almost up to today. In 2015, the Liberals came back to power under Justin Trudeau, the son of Pierre Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is the only example of father-son prime ministers in Canadian history. Justin served for 9 years, but resigned just 2 months ago due to being extremely unpopular, even within his own party. So, as of March 15th, Canada actually has a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. But one of the first things he did was call an election, which means that he might not be Prime Minister for long. That's because he's in a tight race with the Conservatives, now led by Pierre Poilievre. Up until recently, the polls indicated that Poilievre would win easily. But then came this man, who started a trade war with his friendly neighbors, and who even threatened to annex Canada and make it the 51st state. This has led to an unusual wave of patriotism amongst Canadians, and a surge in popularity for the Liberals, now that they have a new leader. Like I said earlier, a lot of people view the Liberals as sort of Canada's default party, and therefore they feel more safe when the Liberals are in power. It certainly helps that the Liberal red matches the red on the Canadian flag, which, by the way, was adopted when the Liberals were in power. So, as usual, it's probably going to be either the Liberals or else the Conservatives. But what's even more certain is that the Bloc and the NDP will probably see their lowest numbers ever, meaning that Canada might be heading back to a two-party system. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Thanks for watching.